The summer heat was already making the asphalt shimmer when Staff Sergeant David Thompson pulled into the quick-stop gas station on Highway 9. He had been driving for 3 hours straight, heading home to see his mother after completing a grueling 6-month deployment overseas. The Army Ranger patches on his desert camouflage uniform were still crisp, and his boots were polished to a mirror shine despite the long journey. David stepped out of his pickup truck and stretched his legs. The familiar sights of his hometown brought a smile to his face. He had grown up just 2 miles from this very gas station, playing basketball at the court across the street and buying candy with pocket money his grandmother gave him. Now, at 28, he was coming home as a decorated soldier who had served his country with honor. The bell above the door chimed as David entered the store. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly store owner, looked up from behind the counter, and her face lit up with recognition. "Well, if it isn't little David Thompson," she exclaimed, using the nickname she had called him since he was 10 years old. "Look at you in that uniform. Your mama told me you were coming home today." David grinned and walked over to the counter. "Yes, ma'am, just got back this morning. Thought I'd grab some of those honey buns you used to sell me before heading to Mom's house." Mrs. Patterson beamed with pride as she reached for a package of honey buns. "These are on the house, soldier. Thank you for your service." David was about to protest when the door chimed again. Officer Blake Morrison walked in, his heavy boots making loud thuds on the linoleum floor. David had never met Morrison before, but he could tell from the man's aggressive posture that something was off. Morrison's eyes immediately locked onto David, scanning him from head to toe with obvious suspicion. The officer was a large man, probably in his early 40s, with a thick neck and permanent scowl lines around his mouth. "What's going on here?" Morrison asked, his voice carrying an edge that made Mrs. Patterson's smile fade. David turned around slowly, keeping his hands visible. He had been trained to handle tense situations, and something about this officer's demeanor told him to be careful. "Good afternoon, officer," David said politely. "I'm just stopping by to see Mrs. Patterson before heading home." Morrison stepped closer, his hand resting on his belt near his weapon. "You live around here?" "Born and raised, sir. David Thompson. I grew up on Maple Street." The officer's eyes narrowed as he looked at David's uniform. "That's supposed to impress me? Anyone can buy a uniform at a surplus store." Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her voice shaky but determined. "Officer Morrison, this is David Thompson. I've known him since he was a child. He's a real soldier, just came back from overseas." Morrison glared at her. "Ma'am, I need you to step back and let me handle this." David reached slowly into his chest pocket. "Officer, I have my military identification right here if you'd like to see it." "Keep your hands where I can see them," Morrison barked, his voice echoing through the small store. Other customers began to notice the commotion. A young mother with 2 small children quickly ushered them toward the back of the store. An elderly man at the coffee machine turned around to watch, his face filled with concern. David raised his hand slightly. "Sir, I'm just trying to show you my ID. I'm Staff Sergeant David Thompson, 75th Ranger Regiment." Morrison's face twisted with anger. "I don't care what some piece of paper says. I know trouble when I see it." The tension in the store was becoming thick enough to cut with a knife. Mrs. Patterson's hands were trembling as she watched the scene unfold. She had known David since he was a boy, had watched him grow up to be respectful and kind. She couldn't understand why the officer was treating him this way. David kept his voice calm and steady. "Officer Morrison, is there a problem?" "I haven't done anything wrong." "Don't you tell me there's no problem," Morrison snapped. "I decide what's a problem around here." A teenage employee named Carlos was restocking shelves nearby. He quietly pulled out his phone and started recording, sensing that something was very wrong. His hands were shaking, but he kept the camera steady. Morrison stepped even closer to David, invading his personal space. "You think that uniform makes you special? You think it gives you the right to walk around here like you own the place?" David's military training kicked in. He knew how to de-escalate situations, how to remain calm under pressure. But he also knew that this situation was spiraling out of control for reasons he couldn't understand. "Sir, I have the utmost respect for law enforcement," David said quietly. "I'm not trying to cause any trouble. I'm just visiting family." Morrison's face was getting red with anger. "Family? What family? I know every decent family in this town, and they don't look like you." The words hit David like a physical blow. Mrs. Patterson gasped audibly. Carlos's grip tightened on his phone as he continued recording. The other customers in the store stood frozen. Unable to believe what they were hearing, David felt his heart rate increase, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding here is you thinking you can disrespect me." Morrison snarled. Without warning, Morrison grabbed David's arm roughly. David's military reflexes almost kicked in, but he forced himself to remain still. He knew that any sudden movement could make things much worse. "Officer, please," Mrs. Patterson called out. "He hasn't done anything wrong." Morrison whirled around to face her. "Ma'am, if you don't step back, I'll arrest you for interfering with police business." David could see the fear in Mrs. Patterson's eyes, and it made his chest tight with anger. This woman had been like a grandmother to him, had always treated him with kindness and respect. Seeing her frightened because of him was almost unbearable. "It's okay, Mrs. Patterson," David said softly. Everything's going to be fine, but everything was not fine. Morrison was clearly escalating the situation, and David could see other customers pulling out their phones to record. He knew this was about to become much bigger than a simple misunderstanding. Morrison twisted David's arm behind his back, applying more pressure than necessary. "You're under arrest for disorderly conduct and resisting arrest." "I haven't resisted anything," David said through gritted teeth. "You're resisting right now," Morrison replied, pushing David toward the door as they moved toward the exit. "David," caught Mrs. Patterson's eye. She looked heartbroken and confused. Unable to understand how a simple homecoming visit had turned into this nightmare, Carlos followed at a distance, still recording everything on his phone. Other customers were doing the same, their faces filled with shock and disbelief. Outside the store, Morrison roughly pushed David against the side of his patrol car. The hot metal burned through David's uniform, but he didn't make a sound. He had endured much worse during his military service, but this was different. This was happening in his own hometown, in front of people who had known him his whole life. As Morrison reached for his handcuffs, David closed his eyes and thought about his mother, waiting at home for her son to return safely from war. He thought about his fellow soldiers who had trusted him to watch their backs in dangerous situations. He thought about the oath he had taken to defend his country. Even when his country didn't seem willing to defend him, the handcuffs clicked shut, and David Thompson found himself under arrest in the place he had always called home. The holding cell at the Millbrook County Police Station smelled like disinfectant and despair. David sat on the hard metal bench, still wearing his army uniform, trying to process what had just happened. His hands were free now, but he could still feel the pressure of the handcuffs on his wrists. 3 hours had passed since Officer Morrison had arrested him at the gas station. 3 hours of paperwork, mugshots, and fingerprinting. 3 hours of being treated like a criminal when all he had wanted to do was buy honey buns and go home to his mother. The desk sergeant, Officer Williams, seemed uncomfortable with the whole situation. He was a younger man, probably in his late 20s, and he kept glancing at David with a confused expression. "Sergeant Thompson," Officer Williams said quietly, approaching the cell. "Your phone call." David stood up slowly, his body stiff from sitting on the uncomfortable bench. He followed Williams to a phone mounted on the wall near the booking desk. With shaking hands, David dialed his mother's number. She answered on the second ring. "David? Baby, where are you?" "I've been waiting for hours." David closed his eyes, trying to find the right words. "Mom, I'm at the police station. I've been arrested." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like forever. "Arrested? For what?" "David, what happened?" "I don't really know, Mom. I stopped at Mrs. Patterson's store, and Officer Morrison said I was causing trouble." I wasn't doing anything wrong, I promise. His mother's voice was tight with worry. I'm calling your father's old lawyer right now. Don't say anything else to anyone until he gets there. After hanging up, David was led back to his cell. Officer. Williams locked the door but didn't meet his eyes. Williams? David called softly. The young officer turned around. You know this isn't right, don't you? Williams looked around nervously, then walked closer to the cell. Look, man, I can't talk about ongoing cases, but ... He paused, struggling with his words. I served 2 Marines, 2 tours in Afghanistan. David nodded, understanding passing between them without words. Just hang in there, Williams whispered before walking away. Meanwhile, 60 miles away at Fort Bragg, Colonel Patricia Rodriguez was finishing up her daily briefing when her aide knocked. On her office door, Ma'am, we have a situation. One of our rangers was arrested in his hometown today. Colonel Rodriguez looked up from her paperwork. In her 22 years of military service, she had dealt with plenty of soldiers getting into trouble on leave. Usually it involved too much drinking or bar fights. What's the charge? That's just it, ma'am. The charges are disorderly conduct and resisting arrest, but the circumstances seem ... unusual. The aide handed her a tablet showing a video that had already been posted on social media. The footage was shaky, but clear enough to see what happened. Colonel Rodriguez watched in growing disbelief as she saw Staff Sergeant David Thompson being arrested simply for existing in a gas station while wearing his Army uniform. How many views does this have? She asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. It's going viral, ma'am. Over 50,000 views in the last 2 hours. Local news stations are already picking it up. Colonel Rodriguez set down the tablet and rubbed her temples. This was exactly the kind of incident that could damage the military's relationship with civilian communities. More importantly, one of her soldiers was being mistreated for no apparent reason. Get me everything we have on Staff Sergeant Thompson. Service record, commendations, everything. And give me the phone number for the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department. Back at the gas station, Mrs. Patterson was sitting in her office behind the store, still shaken by what she had witnessed. She had called David's mother immediately after the arrest, but she couldn't stop thinking about the look of confusion and hurt in David's eyes. Carlos, the teenage employee who had recorded the incident, sat across from her. His phone was buzzing constantly with notifications as his video spread across social media. Mrs. Patterson, people are asking me to go on the news and talk about what happened. The elderly woman looked up at him with tired eyes. Carlos, honey, you do whatever you think is right. But that boy ... David, he's one of the good ones. I've known him since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. He's never caused trouble a day in his life, Carlos nodded. I know, that's why I recorded it. Nobody should be treated like that, especially not someone who serves our country. Mrs. Patterson's phone rang. The caller ID showed the local news station. Mrs. Patterson, this is Jennifer Chun from Channel 7 News. We understand there was an incident at your store today involving a soldier and a police officer. Would you be willing to give us a statement? Mrs. Patterson looked out through her office window at the store where she had worked for 35 years. She had always tried to stay out of trouble, to mind her own business. But this was different. Yes, she said firmly. I'll talk to you. At the police station, Chief Robert Hayes was having the worst day of his career. Officer Morrison was his nephew, and the family connection had probably protected Morrison from consequences in the past. But this incident was different. The video was everywhere, and his phone hadn't stopped ringing. The mayor had already called twice. The county sheriff had called. Even the governor's office had reached out for information. Chief Hayes knocked on the door of the holding area. Morrison, get in my office, now. Officer Morrison swaggered into the chief's office with his usual arrogant attitude. Chief, before you say anything, that guy was definitely up to something? You can't trust people like that. Chief Hayes felt his blood pressure rising. People like what, Morrison? You know what I mean? No, I don't know what you mean. Explain it to me. Morrison shifted uncomfortably. Look, I was just doing my job. Keeping the community safe. Chief Hayes turned his computer monitor around so Morrison could see the video playing on repeat. Does this look like keeping the community safe to you? For the first time, Morrison looked uncertain. People don't understand police work. They don't see the whole picture. The whole picture? The whole picture is that you arrested a decorated Army Ranger for buying honey buns while black. Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you've brought down on this department? Morrison's face flushed red. I don't see color, Chief. I treat everyone the same. Really? Because I've been looking at your arrest record, and there's definitely a pattern here. At David's family home, his mother Rosa was pacing the living room while she waited for the layer to call back. The local news was playing on the television, and she could see her son being led away in handcuffs over and over again. David's younger sister, Maria, had driven over as soon as she heard the news. She sat on the couch, scrolling through social media and updating her mother on what people were saying. Mom, there are thousands of comments supporting David. People are sharing their own stories about Officer Morrison. Apparently, this isn't the first time something like this has happened. Rosa stopped pacing and looked at her daughter. What do you mean? There are at least a dozen other people saying Morrison hassled them or their family members, always people of color, always for no good reason. The phone rang, and Rosa rushed to answer it. Mrs. Thompson, this is Attorney Johnson. I'm on my way to the police station now. Is David hurt? I don't think so, but he sounded shaken up. Don't worry. We're going to get him out of there tonight. And then we're going to make sure this never happens to anyone else's son. As night fell over the small town of Millbrook, the story of David Thompson's arrest was spreading far beyond the county lines. Social media posts were being shared thousands of times. News outlets from around the state were sending reporters. To cover the story at the police station, David sat in his cell and watched the sunset through a small barred window. He thought about his fellow soldiers who were still overseas, still fighting for the ideals of freedom and justice. He wondered what they would think if they could see him now. Officer Williams appeared at his cell again. Thompson, your lawyers. Here, you're getting out. As David stood up to leave, Williams spoke quietly. For what it's worth, most of us aren't like Morrison. David nodded. I know. And for what it's worth, this won't change how I feel about serving my country. Williams unlocked the cell door. That's what makes you a better man than most. David walked out of the holding area with his head held high, knowing that his real fight was just beginning. The arrest was over, but the battle for justice had only just started. 3 days after David Thompson walked out of the Millbrook County Jail, Attorney Lisa Johnson was sitting in her downtown office, surrounded by stacks of legal documents and her laptop showing news coverage that seemed to update every hour. She had taken on plenty of difficult cases in her 15-year career, but something about David's situation had struck a nerve. Lisa had built her reputation, defending people who couldn't defend themselves. She had grown up in a working-class family where every dollar mattered, so she understood what it felt like to be powerless against systems that seemed designed to work against you. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. Miss Johnson, my commanding officer wants to speak with you. Colonel Rodriguez from Fort Bragg. Lisa set down her coffee and dialed the number David had provided. Colonel Rodriguez answered on the first ring. Attorney Johnson, thank you for taking my call. I want to discuss Staff Sergeant Thompson's case with you. Of course, Colonel. Though I should mention that attorney-client privilege limits what I can share. I understand completely. But I want you to know that the Army is taking this incident very seriously. Sergeant Thompson is one of our finest soldiers, and what happened to him is completely unacceptable. Lisa leaned back in her chair. Military involvement could complicate things, but it could also provide resources and credibility that might help David's case. What exactly is the Army's position on this? We're conducting our own investigation into potential violations of Sergeant Thompson's rights as military personnel. We're also looking into whether this incident represents a pattern that affects other service members. Lisa made notes as Colonel Rodriguez spoke. That's interesting. Have there been other incidents? That's what we intend to find out. I'm assigning Captain Michael Torres to work as a liaison with civilian authorities. He'll be in touch with you soon. After hanging up, Lisa turned her attention to the boxes of documents that had arrived that morning. David's military records painted a picture of an exemplary soldier. Multiple commendations, spotless disciplinary record, and glowing reviews from superior officers. Her assistant knocked on the door. "Lisa, there's a reporter here from the Washington Herald. Says she's been investigating police misconduct in small towns." Lisa looked up. National media attention could be helpful, but it could also turn David's case into a circus. "Send her in." Reporter Catherine Walsh was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. She carried a digital recorder and a thick notebook filled with handwritten notes. "Miss Johnson, I've been following the Thompson case since the video went viral. I think this story is bigger than just one incident." Lisa studied the reporter carefully. "What do you mean?" Catherine opened her notebook. "I've been investigating Officer Morrison's arrest patterns for the past 3 years. Out of 67 arrests he's made, 59 involved people of color. Of those 59 arrests, 43 resulted in charges being dropped or reduced significantly." The numbers hit Lisa like a punch to the stomach. "Where did you get this information?" "Public records." "Court documents." "Interviews with other people who've had encounters with Morrison." Catherine pulled out her phone and showed Lisa a list of names. "I've spoken with 12 people who say Morrison harassed, threatened, or arrested them without proper cause." Minorities, all in situations similar to Sergeant Thompson's." Lisa felt her anger rising. Why hasn't anyone done anything about this before? Small-town politics. Morrison's uncle is the police chief. His father-in-law is on the city council. People complained, but the complaints mysteriously disappeared or were dismissed as misunderstandings. Lisa stood up and walked to her window overlooking the town square. "Catherine, I want to see all your research, and I want to talk to every single person who's willing to go on record about Morrison. Already arranged." "But Lisa, there's something else you should know. Morrison isn't just a bad cop. According to my sources, he's been talking about this case around town. He's not sorry about what happened. If anything, he thinks he's being persecuted for doing his job." That afternoon, David sat in Lisa's conference room across from Captain Torres, a serious young officer with kind eyes and a firm handshake. Also present was FBI agent Rebecca Martinez, who had driven down from the regional office to discuss the federal civil rights investigation. "Sergeant Thompson," Agent Martinez began, "we're opening a civil rights investigation under Section 242 of Title 18. This law makes it a crime for someone acting under color of law to willfully deprive a person of their constitutional rights." David nodded, though the legal language was mostly over his head. Captain Torres leaned forward. "David, the Army wants you to know that we've got your back. What happened to you could happen to any of our soldiers. We can't let that stand." Lisa watched David's reaction. Despite everything he'd been through, he seemed more concerned about the bigger picture than his own situation. "I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else," David said quietly. "When I was sitting in that cell, all I could think about was, what if this had happened to one of my younger soldiers? Someone who didn't have family support or good legal representation?" Agent Martinez made notes. "That's exactly why we're taking this so seriously. Civil rights violations often follow patterns. If we can establish that Officer Morrison systematically targeted people based on race, the penalties become much more severe." Lisa spread out Catherine Walsh's research on the conference table. "Agent Martinez, I think you're going to find that pattern very easily." As Agent Martinez reviewed the documents, her expression grew increasingly grim. "This is damning evidence. We'll need to interview all these witnesses, but if even half of these accounts are accurate, Morrison has been violating civil rights for years." Captain Torres studied the papers. "Colonel Rodriguez is going to want to see this. The Army has installations all over this region. If Morrison or officers like him are targeting our personnel, it becomes a federal issue affecting military readiness," Agent Martinez finished. "Exactly. David looked around the table at the three people working to help him. A week ago, he had been a soldier coming home from deployment. Now he was at the center of a federal investigation that could change how police interact with military personnel across the country. "This feels like it's getting really big," he said. Lisa reached across the table and patted his hand. "David, civil rights. Cases are always big. They have to be. Individual justice is important, but systemic change is what prevents the next David Thompson from ending up in handcuffs for buying honey buns." That evening, David drove to Mrs. Patterson's gas station. He hadn't been back since the incident, but he felt like he needed to face the place where his life had been turned upside down. Mrs. Patterson was behind the counter when he walked in. Her face lit up when she saw him. "David, how are you holding up, honey?" "I'm doing okay, Mrs. Patterson. I wanted to thank you for speaking up for me that day." The elderly woman's eyes filled with tears. "Baby, I should have done more." "I should have stepped in sooner." David shook his head. "You did exactly what you should have done. You told the truth." Carlos appeared from the back room, carrying a stack of newspapers. "Sergeant Thompson, man, you're like famous now. Your story is on the front page of every paper in the state." David looked at the headlines with mixed feelings. Fame wasn't something he had ever wanted, especially not this kind of fame. "Carlos, I want to thank you for recording what happened. If you dn single quotes ... What Morrison did was wrong. Everyone needed to see it." Mrs. Patterson rang up. "David's honey buns. These are still on the house, soldier." "They always will be?" As David drove home, he passed the police station where he had spent the worst night of his life. Officer Williams was getting into his patrol car in the parking lot. He saw David and raised his hand in a small wave. David waved back, thinking about what Williams had said about most cops not being like Morrison. He hoped that was true. He hoped that the investigation would separate the good officers from the bad ones, rather than painting everyone with the same brush. At home, David found his mother and sister glued to the television, watching a news report about his case. "Mom, you need to stop watching this stuff. It's not good for you." Rosa Thompson looked at her son with fierce pride. "David, baby, I'm watching because I want to see justice done. Not just for you, but for everyone who's been treated like you were treated." David sat down between his mother and sister. On the television, Attorney Johnson was giving an interview on the courthouse steps. "This case represents everything that's wrong with how some police officers view certain members of our community," Lisa was saying. "But it also represents an opportunity to demand better, to insist that everyone, regardless of race, regardless of background, be treated with the dignity and respect they deserve." David watched his lawyer speak and felt a mix of gratitude and responsibility. This case was no longer just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been judged by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. His phone buzzed with a text from Captain Torres. "Colonel Rodriguez wants to brief you tomorrow at 0800. The Pentagon is getting involved." David showed the message to his mother and sister. Maria whistled low. "The Pentagon?" "David, this is really big." 2 weeks into the investigation, FBI agent Rebecca Martinez sat in a cramped conference room at the Millbrook County Community Center, interviewing her 8th witness of the day. The woman across from her, Teresa Jackson, was a 34-year-old nurse who had lived in the area her entire life. "Tell me about your encounter with Officer Morrison," Agent Martinez said gently, her digital recorder capturing every word. Teresa's hands shook slightly as she began her story. "It was last October. I was coming home from a 12-hour shift at the hospital, still wearing my scrubs. I stopped at the same gas station where that soldier got arrested just to get some coffee." Agent Martinez nodded encouragingly. "What happened when Officer Morrison arrived?" "He came in while I was paying, took one look at me and asked what I was doing in that part of town. I told him I lived here, that I worked at the county hospital. He said I didn't look like any nurse he knew." The story was painfully familiar. Agent Martinez had heard variations of it from 7 other witnesses over the past 2 days. Different locations, different circumstances, but always the same underlying theme: Officer Morrison, targeting people of color for no apparent reason other than their presence in what he considered his community. Did he arrest you? Teresa shook her head. No, but he followed me home. Sat outside my house for 20 minutes with his lights on like he was trying to intimidate me. My neighbors all saw it. I was so embarrassed. After Teresa left, Agent Martinez reviewed her notes. The pattern was undeniable. Morrison had been systematically harassing minority residents and visitors for at least 3 years, possibly longer. But Teresa's case revealed something new. Morrison seemed to believe he was protecting the community from outsiders, even when those outsiders were longtime residents or people providing essential services. Her phone rang. It was her supervisor at the regional FBI office. Martinez, how's the investigation going? Sir, this is bigger than we initially thought. Morrison isn't just a racist cop. He appears to have been running his own little fiefdom, deciding who belongs in this community and who doesn't. Any indication that other officers were involved? Agent Martinez flipped through her witness statements. No direct evidence of participation, but definitely evidence of willful blindness. Multiple people filed complaints with the police department over the years. Those complaints seem to have disappeared into a black hole. Keep digging. The U.S. Attorney's Office is very interested in this case, especially with the military angle. Meanwhile, at Fort Bragg, Captain Torres was briefing Colonel Rodriguez on his investigation into whether other military personnel had faced similar treatment. Ma'am, I've contacted bases within a 100-mile radius of Millbrook County. So far, I've identified 6 incidents involving our personnel over the past 2 years. Colonel Rodriguez looked up from the report Torres had prepared. 6 incidents of what? Traffic stops that resulted in lengthy detentions without charges. Questioning about military credentials even when personnel were in uniform. 1 case, where a Marine was detained for 3 hours because the officer claimed his military ID looked fake. Were these all Morrison? 3 were Morrison directly. The other 3 involved different officers, but all in the same general area. It appears there's a culture of suspicion toward military personnel, particularly minority service members. Colonel Rodriguez set down the report and rubbed her temples. As a Latina woman who had risen to the rank of colonel, she had faced her share of discrimination. But the idea that soldiers serving their country were being targeted by the very communities they protected made her blood boil. Captain, I want you to expand this investigation. Contact every base in the Southeast. If this is happening in North Carolina, it's probably happening elsewhere. Yes, ma'am. Colonel, there's something else. I've been in contact with Sergeant Thompson's attorney. She's uncovered evidence that suggests Morrison has been specifically targeting people he perceives as outsiders, regardless of their legal right to be in the community. What kind of evidence? Torres pulled out his tablet and showed her a map that Lisa Johnson had created. Red dots represent Morrison's arrests over the past 3 years. Blue dots represent the demographics of people who live in those areas. Colonel Rodriguez studied the map. The pattern was striking. Morrison's arrests were concentrated in areas with significant minority populations, but the people he arrested often didn't live in those areas. They were visitors, workers, people passing through. He's acting like a border guard for his own personal version of the community, she said grimly. That's exactly what Attorney Johnson thinks. And ma'am, there's something else. The Pentagon has asked me to prepare a briefing for the Secretary of Defense's office. Colonel Rodriguez raised her eyebrows. The Secretary? This really is going all the way to the top. Back in Millbrook, David was discovering that being at the center of a national news story was both empowering and exhausting. His phone rang constantly with interview requests, which he politely declined on the advice of his attorney. But he couldn't ignore the impact the case was having on his community. That evening, David attended a town hall meeting that the mayor had called to address community concerns about the case. The high school auditorium was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and sitting in the aisles. Mayor Tom Bradley, a man in his 60s who had held office for 12 years, stood at the podium looking uncomfortable. called this meeting to address the recent incident involving Officer Morrison and to hear from community members about their concerns. The first person to speak was Reverend James Washington from the First Baptist Church. He was a tall, dignified man who had been a civil rights activist in his youth. Mayor Bradley, this incident with Sergeant Thompson isn't an isolated event. Our community has been dealing with Officer Morrison's behavior for years. The question is, what are you going to do about it? A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The mayor cleared his throat. Reverend Washington, I want to assure everyone that we take these allegations seriously. The police department is conducting a thorough internal investigation. A woman in the back of the room stood up. Mayor, with all due respect, having the police investigate themselves is like having the fox guard the henhouse. We need outside oversight. David recognized her as Dr. Angela Carter, the emergency room physician who had treated him for minor injuries after a training accident 2 years earlier. Dr. Carter makes a good point, said another voice from the crowd. It was Mrs. Patterson, from the gas station. I've seen how these internal investigations work. They're more about protecting the department than finding the truth. The mayor looked increasingly flustered. Ladies and gentlemen, we have procedures in place. Your procedures haven't worked, shouted a young man near the front. My brother was harassed by Morrison 6 months ago. He filed a complaint and nothing happened. Nothing. David felt the anger and frustration in the room, and he understood it. These were people who had been ignored and dismissed for years. His case had simply shined a light on problems that had existed all along. When the mayor opened the floor for more comments, David surprised himself by standing up. Mayor Bradley, I'm Staff Sergeant David Thompson. The auditorium fell silent. Every head turned to look at him. I want everyone to know that I don't hate Officer Morrison, and I don't hate the police. I've worked with military police throughout my career, and I know that most law enforcement officers are good people doing a difficult job. He paused, gathering his thoughts, but what happened to me was wrong. And from what I'm hearing tonight, it's been happening to other people for a long time. The question isn't whether Officer Morrison is a bad person. The question is whether our community is going to accept that some people get treated differently than others. The applause that followed was thunderous. David continued, his voice growing stronger. I took an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States. That Constitution promises equal protection under the law for everyone, not just soldiers, not just white people, everyone. When he sat down, the energy in the room had shifted. People were no longer just angry. They were focused. After the meeting, David was approached by dozens of community members. Some thanked him for his service. Others shared their own stories of encounters with Morrison. A few offered to help with his case in any way they could. As David walked to his car, he was joined by Reverend Washington. Son, you handled yourself well in there. You showed real leadership. Thank you, Reverend. But I'm just trying to do what's right. That's exactly what leadership is, the Reverend replied. Doing what's right when it would be easier to stay quiet. David drove home thinking about the faces he had seen in the auditorium. Young and old, black and white, people who worked hard and played by the rules but had been made to feel like second-class citizens in their own community. His phone buzzed with a text from Agent Martinez. Thompson, we found 12 more witnesses. Morrison's pattern of behavior goes back at least 5 years. This case is going to trial. David felt a mix of relief and apprehension. Going to trial meant that the truth would come out, but it also meant months more of having his life under a microscope. He thought about what Reverend Washington had said about leadership. The phone call from the Pentagon came at exactly 7:30 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. Colonel Rodriguez was finishing her morning coffee when her aide knocked on her office door with an expression she had rarely seen in her 22 years of military service. Ma'am, you have a call from General Patricia Williams, Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel at the Pentagon. Colonel Rodriguez straightened her uniform and took the call. General Williams was a legend in the Army, the highest-ranking African-American woman in military history, and someone Rodriguez had admired from afar for years. Colonel Rodriguez, I'm calling about the Thompson case. The Secretary of Defense has asked me to lead a comprehensive review of how our service members are treated in civilian encounters, particularly regarding potential discrimination. Yes, ma'am. We've been documenting incidents involving Sergeant Thompson and other personnel in the region. Your documentation is exactly why I'm calling. The Secretary wants this review to be thorough, transparent, and nationwide. We're not just looking at one bad cop in North Carolina. We're examining whether our service members face systematic discrimination while representing their country. Colonel Rodriguez felt the weight of the moment. Ma'am, what exactly will this review entail? We're calling it the Military Personnel Protection Initiative. We'll be examining policies, training, and coordination between military installations and local law enforcement. We'll also be creating new protocols for how these incidents are reported and investigated. General Williams paused, and Rodriguez could hear papers shuffling in the background. Colonel, I'm appointing you as the regional coordinator for the Southeast. You'll be working directly with my office to implement this review across all installations from Virginia to Florida. 3 days later, David found himself in an unusual position, sitting in a Pentagon conference room, wearing his dress uniform, facing some of the highest-ranking military officials in the country. General Williams entered the room with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. She was followed by 2 other generals, a Navy admiral, and several civilian advisors from the Department of Defense. Sergeant Thompson, General Williams said, extending her hand. Thank you for your service, and thank you for agreeing to participate in this review. David shook her hand, still somewhat overwhelmed by the surreal nature of the situation. Ma'am, I'm honored to help in any way I can. General Williams gestured for everyone to sit. Sergeant, we want you to understand that what happened to you represents a failure on multiple levels. Not just a failure by Officer Morrison, but a failure by systems that should have protected you as a member of our armed forces. She opened a thick folder in front of her. Our preliminary investigation has revealed that incidents like yours are not isolated. In the past 3 years, we've documented over 200 cases of military personnel facing discriminatory treatment by civilian law enforcement. David felt his stomach drop. 200? 200 documented cases. We suspect there are many more that were never officially reported. General Williams turned to one of her aides. Captain Anderson, please brief Sergeant Thompson on our findings. Captain Anderson, a young officer with a serious demeanor, stood and activated a presentation. Screen. Sir, our research shows several disturbing patterns. Military personnel of color are 3 times more likely to be detained during routine police encounters than their white counterparts. They're also more likely to have their military credentials questioned, even when in uniform. The statistics appeared on the screen, and David studied them with growing alarm. Ma'am, why haven't we heard about this before? General Williams leaned forward. Because most service members don't report these incidents either out of fear of retaliation or because they don't think anyone will take them seriously. Your case is different because it was recorded and went public. Another aide spoke up. Sergeant Thompson, we've interviewed 57 service members who experienced similar incidents. Would you like to hear some of their stories? David nodded, though he wasn't sure he was ready for what he was about to hear. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Rodriguez, stationed at Fort Campbell, was pulled over for allegedly speeding while driving to her base housing. The officer questioned whether she really lived on base, demanded to search her car, and held her for 2 hours before releasing her without a ticket. Corporal Michael Johnson, home on leave from deployment, was arrested outside a movie theater for allegedly loitering. He was in civilian clothes but had his military ID. The arresting officer said anyone could buy fake military identification online. Lieutenant Commander Patricia Davis, a Navy officer visiting her family, was followed by police for 6 blocks through her childhood neighborhood. When she stopped to ask why she was being followed, she was told she didn't belong in that area. Each story hit David like a physical blow. These weren't just statistics. They were his fellow service members, people who had sworn the same oath he had taken, facing the same inexplicable hostility he had experienced. General Williams closed the folder. Sergeant Thompson, this is why the Pentagon Review is so important. We cannot allow the men and women who volunteer to defend our nation to be treated as second-class citizens by the very communities they serve. David found his voice. Ma'am, what exactly will this review accomplish? Several things, General Williams replied. First, we're creating new reporting mechanisms so incidents like these are properly documented and investigated. Second, we're developing training programs for both military personnel and civilian law enforcement on how to interact professionally with each other. She paused and looked directly at David. Third, we're establishing liaison programs between military installations and local police departments. And fourth, we're creating legal support networks, so service members who face discrimination have immediate access to resources. One of the civilian advisors spoke up. Sergeant Thompson, we're also recommending changes to federal law that would make discrimination against military personnel a specific federal crime, with enhanced penalties. David thought about all the witnesses in his own case, all the people who had faced similar treatment from Officer Morrison and others like him. Will this help people who aren't in the military? The other people who've been targeted? General Williams smiled. That's an excellent question, and it shows the kind of character that makes you an outstanding soldier. While our mandate is specifically for military personnel, we're coordinating closely with the Department of Justice on broader civil rights enforcement. After the briefing, David found himself walking through the Pentagon corridors with Captain Torres, who had been assigned as his escort for the day. This is overwhelming, David admitted. I can imagine. But Sergeant, you should know that your case has already made a difference. 3 police departments in our region have reached out proactively to establish better relations with nearby military installations. They stopped at a window overlooking the Pentagon parking lot, where hundreds of cars bore license plates from all 50 states and dozens of foreign countries. You know what's interesting? Captain Torres said. Everyone in this building, regardless of rank or position, has sworn the same oath you have, to support and defend the Constitution. Sometimes that means fighting foreign enemies. Sometimes it means fighting for constitutional principles right here at home. David nodded. Captain, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think this review will actually change anything? Or is it just going to be a bunch of paperwork that gets filed away and forgotten? Captain Torres was quiet for a moment. Honestly, that depends partly on people like you. The Pentagon can create policies and procedures, but real change happens when individual service members are willing to stand up and demand better. That evening, David called his mother from his hotel room near the Pentagon. How did it go, baby? Mom? It was incredible and terrifying at the same time. They're creating this whole new program because of what happened to me. I'm proud of you, David. Your father would be proud, too. David thought about his father, who had served in Vietnam and rarely talked about his experiences. Mom, did Dad ever face anything like this when he came home from the war? Rosa was quiet for a long moment. Baby, your father faced things I hope you never have to face. But he always said that every generation has to fight the same fights. Over again in different ways? What do you mean? He meant that freedom and justice aren't things you win once and then keep forever. Every generation has to earn them again. After hanging up, David stood at his hotel window looking out at the Capitol dome in the distance. Somewhere in that building, laws were made that affected millions of people. Tomorrow, some of those laws might be different because of what had happened to him in a gas station in small-town North Carolina. His phone buzzed with a text from Attorney Johnson. David, the Pentagon Review is front-page news in every major newspaper in the country. You've started something that's going to help a lot of people. David thought about Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been detained for allegedly speeding while driving home. He thought about Corporal Johnson, arrested for loitering outside a movie theater. He thought about all the service members whose stories hadn't been told yet. The pressure on Mayor Tom Bradley had been building for weeks, but it reached a breaking point on the morning he found 200 protesters gathered peacefully outside, City Hall, they carried signs reading "Justice for Sergeant Thompson" and "End Police Discrimination and Military Lives Matter Too." Leading the crowd was Reverend Washington, who had organized what he called a prayer march for justice. The demonstrators weren't angry or violent. They were determined and organized, representing churches, veteran groups, civil rights organizations, and ordinary citizens who had grown tired of watching injustice happen in their community. Mayor Bradley watched from his office window as news crews from 3 major networks set up their equipment. This was no longer a local story that might go away if he waited long enough. This had become a national symbol of everything wrong with police accountability in small-town America. His secretary knocked on the door. "Mr. Mayor, you have 17 media requests for interviews, 6 calls from state legislators, and the governor's office wants to schedule a conference call this afternoon." Bradley rubbed his temples. At 62 years old, he had planned to serve out his final term quietly, maybe focusing on getting the new library built and fixing the potholes on Main Street. Instead, he was dealing with federal investigations, Pentagon reviews, and the kind of national attention that could destroy a political career overnight. His phone rang. The caller ID showed it was City Council Chairman Robert Hayes, who also happened to be Officer Morrison's father-in-law. "Tom, we need to talk. This situation is getting out of hand." "Robert, I'm doing everything I can to manage this crisis." "Are you? Because from where I sit, it looks like you're letting outside agitators destroy our community's reputation." Mayor Bradley felt his patience finally snap. "Outside agitators? Robert, these are our neighbors. These are people who live here, work here, pay taxes here, and they're asking for basic fairness." Morrison made a judgment call in a difficult situation. That soldier was probably up to something. "Robert, have you watched the video?" "Because I've watched it about 50 times, and I can't see anything that Sergeant did wrong except exist while black." The silence on the other end of the line stretched uncomfortably long. "Tom, I think you're forgetting who your real supporters are in this community." "No, Robert. I think I'm finally remembering who I'm supposed to represent." After hanging up, Mayor Bradley made a decision that would define the rest of his political career. He called Police Chief Hayes to his office immediately. Chief Hayes arrived 20 minutes later, looking like a man who hadn't slept well in weeks. His nephew's actions had put him in an impossible position, and the federal investigation was uncovering years of complaints that he had either ignored or actively suppressed. "Chief, we need to discuss Officer Morrison's employment status." "Tom, Morrison is family. I can't just throw him to the wolves." "He's not being thrown to the wolves. He's being held accountable for his actions." Mayor Bradley pulled out a thick folder. "I've been reviewing the FBI's findings. Morrison has been systematically targeting minority residents for years. How did you not know about this?" Chief Hayes shifted uncomfortably. "Police work is complicated. Sometimes what looks bad from the outside makes sense when you understand the full context." "What context could possibly justify arresting a decorated Army Ranger for buying honey buns?" "Morrison thought ... I don't care what Morrison thought. I care what Morrison did. And what he did was violate that soldier's constitutional rights, while wearing a uniform that represents our entire community." The mayor stood up and walked to his window, where he could still see the peaceful protesters. "Chief, I'm giving you a choice. Either Morrison resigns today, or I'm calling for your resignation as well." Meanwhile, across town, David was meeting with his legal team at Attorney Johnson's office. The room was crowded with lawyers, FBI agents, Pentagon liaisons, and civil rights advocates who had joined the case. Attorney Johnson spread out the latest legal filings. "David, the U.S. Attorney's Office is moving forward with federal civil rights charges against Morrison. They're also investigating the police department for pattern and practice violations." Agent Martinez nodded. "We've now documented 23 separate incidents involving Morrison over the past 5 years. We've also found evidence that complaints were systematically buried or dismissed without proper investigation." Captain Torres looked up from his laptop. "The Pentagon review has uncovered 47 additional cases across the Southeast involving Similar patterns of discrimination against military personnel. Your case has opened the floodgates. David felt overwhelmed by the scope of what his arrest had revealed. This is so much bigger than what happened to me. That's exactly the point, said Lisa Johnson. Individual cases of discrimination are terrible, but systemic discrimination is a threat to democracy itself. When law enforcement officers can target people based on race or perceived outsider status without consequences, it undermines the rule of law for everyone. A new voice joined the conversation. That's why we're here. Everyone turned to see Catherine Walsh, the investigative reporter, entering with a woman David didn't recognize. David, I'd like you to meet Dr. Jennifer Hamilton. She's a professor of criminal justice at Duke University and an expert on police reform. Dr. Hamilton was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Sergeant Thompson, I've been studying your case as part of a broader research project on police misconduct in rural communities. She pulled out her own laptop and connected it to the conference room's display screen. What we're seeing in Millbrook County fits a pattern that's been documented across the country. Small police departments with limited oversight, family connections that prevent accountability, and a culture that sees certain residents as belonging while others are viewed with suspicion. The screen showed a map of the United States dotted with hundreds of red markers. Each red dot represents a documented case similar to yours over the past decade. Rural police departments, minority victims, evidence of systematic bias, and initial attempts to cover up or minimize the incidents. David studied the map with growing alarm. Dr. Hamilton, are you saying this happens everywhere? Not everywhere, but more places than most people realize. The difference in your case is that it was recorded, it involved a sympathetic victim with military credentials, and it happened at a time when the public is finally demanding accountability. FBI agent Martinez leaned forward. Dr. Hamilton, what does your research suggest about effective reforms? 3 things are essential: external oversight, data collection, and community involvement. Police departments can't investigate themselves. They must track and report demographic data on all encounters, and communities must have a meaningful voice in police policies. Attorney Johnson made notes. Those recommendations align perfectly with what we're asking for in our civil lawsuit. The meeting was interrupted by David's phone ringing. He looked at the caller ID and saw it was his mother. Mom, I'm in a meeting. Can I call you back? David, baby, you need to turn on the news right now. Channel 7, David looked around the room. Can someone turn on the news? Captain Torres found the remote and switched to the local news channel. The breaking news banner read, Millbrook Police. Chief announces major reforms. On screen, Chief Hayes stood at a podium outside the police station, looking uncomfortable but determined. Effective immediately, Officer Blake Morrison has been terminated from the Millbrook County Police Department. Additionally, I am announcing a comprehensive reform package that will ensure this type of incident never happens again. The room fell silent as everyone listened to the chief's announcement. We are implementing mandatory bias training for all officers, creating a civilian oversight board, and establishing new protocols for documenting and investigating complaints. We are also partnering with the regional FBI office to conduct an independent review of all arrests made over the past 5 years. David felt a mix of satisfaction and caution. This is good news, but is it enough? Attorney Johnson muted the television. It's a start, David, but real change takes time and constant vigilance. Dr. Hamilton nodded. The fact that they're implementing these reforms shows that pressure works. But you'll need to stay engaged to make sure the reforms are actually implemented, and not just announced. That evening, David attended another community meeting, this one organized by Reverend Washington at the First Baptist Church. The sanctuary was packed with people of all races and backgrounds, united by their desire to see justice done and their community improved. Reverend Washington introduced David to the crowd. Brothers and sisters, Sergeant Thompson could have taken his settlement money and moved away from here. Instead, he's chosen to stay and fight for changes that will benefit all of us. David stood at the pulpit, looking out at the faces of his neighbors. Thank you, Reverend Washington. I want everyone to know that what happened to me was wrong, but it's not unique. It's been happening to people in this community for years." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But I also want you to know that most police officers are good people who want to protect and serve everyone fairly." Chief Hayes announced reforms today that could make our... The federal courthouse in Raleigh was buzzing with activity on the morning of Officer Blake Morrison's sentencing hearing. 6 months had passed since David Thompson's arrest, and the legal proceedings had moved with unusual speed for a federal civil rights case. Outside the courthouse, supporters of both sides gathered under the watchful eyes of federal marshals. On one side stood David Thompson's supporters, his family, fellow veterans, civil rights activists, and community members from Millbrook County who had been affected by Morrison's pattern of misconduct. On the other side, a smaller group of Morrisons. Supporters held signs reading "Support our police," and Morrison was doing his job. David arrived at the courthouse wearing his Army dress uniform, accompanied by his mother, sister, and Attorney Johnson. The decision to wear his uniform had been deliberate. He wanted to remind everyone that this case was about more than one individual incident. It was about respect for military service and constitutional rights. Inside the courthouse, U.S. Attorney Sarah Williams addressed Judge Margaret Chun, who would be presiding over the sentencing. "Your Honor, the defendant's actions represent a clear violation of Sergeant Thompson's civil rights under federal law. But more than that, they represent a pattern of discriminatory conduct that undermined the rule of law in Millbrook County." The prosecution had built an overwhelming case. 23 victims had testified about their encounters with Morrison. The FBI had documented evidence of systematic bias, including Morrison's own text messages and social media posts that revealed deeply held racist views. Morrison's defense attorney, James Parker, had argued that his client was following department policies and acting on legitimate law enforcement concerns. But the evidence had been too strong, and Morrison had eventually accepted a plea agreement rather than risk a longer sentence at trial. Judge Chun reviewed the sentencing guidelines before speaking. "Officer Morrison, you took an oath to protect and serve all members of your community. Instead, you used your position of authority to target and intimidate people based on the color of their skin." Morrison stood at the defendant's table, his face showing no emotion. His wife sat in the gallery behind him, tears streaming down her face. "The evidence in this case shows that you violated not just Sergeant Thompson's rights, but the rights of dozens of other citizens over a period of several years. Your actions brought shame to the law enforcement profession and damaged the relationship between police and the community you were supposed to serve." Judge Chen paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the courtroom. "I am sentencing you to 3 years in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised probation. You are also permanently barred from working in law enforcement in any capacity." Morrison's wife let out a sob. David felt no satisfaction in her pain, only sadness that it had come to this after the sentencing. David found himself standing on the courthouse steps, facing a crowd of reporters and cameras. Attorney Johnson stood beside him, along with FBI Agent Martinez and Captain Torres. "Sergeant Thompson," called out a reporter from CNN, "how do you feel about Officer Morrison's sentence?" David took a deep breath before answering. "I don't feel joy about anyone going to prison, but I do feel like justice has been served. Officer Morrison's sentence sends a clear message that law enforcement officers who violate people's constitutional rights will be held accountable." Another reporter shouted a question. "What impact do you think this case will have on police reform nationally?" "I hope it shows that change is possible when communities demand it and when good people in law enforcement support it," David replied. "This case isn't just about one bad officer. It's about creating systems that prevent future Officer Morrisons from causing harm." Captain Torres stepped forward. "I'd like to add that the Pentagon's Military Personnel Protection Initiative, which grew out of Sergeant Thompson's case, has already been implemented at over 200 military installations across the country. We're seeing real improvements in how our service members are treated in civilian encounters, After the press conference, David and his family drove back to Millbrook County. The town had changed significantly over the past 6 months. The promised police reforms had been implemented under the oversight of a federal monitor, a civilian. Review board had been established with real authority to investigate complaints. Most importantly, the culture of the police department had begun to shift. The new police chief, Rebecca Santos, was a reform-minded professional who had been recruited from a larger department with a strong record on community policing. She had fired 2 additional officers whose histories showed patterns of misconduct and had implemented comprehensive training programs on bias, de-escalation, and constitutional policing. David stopped by Mrs. Patterson's gas station as he had done regularly since his arrest. The elderly store owner greeted him with her usual warm smile. "How did it go in court today, honey?" "Morrison got 3 years in federal prison," David replied. "It's over." Mrs. Patterson nodded thoughtfully. "You know, David, I've been thinking about what your father used to say about justice being a long arc that bends slowly." "What do you mean?" "I mean that what happened here, it's just one bend in that arc. You helped bend it toward justice, but the work isn't finished." David understood what she meant. The legal case was over, but the broader work of building a more just community would continue long after the headlines faded. That evening, David attended a ceremony at the Millbrook County Community Center. The Civilian Oversight Board was being officially inaugurated, and David had been asked to speak at the event. The community center was filled with people who had been involved in the fight for police reform. Reverend Washington was there, along with Dr. Carter from the hospital, Carlos from the gas station, and dozens of other residents who had attended the town halls and protests. Mayor Bradley, who had surprised many people by becoming a strong advocate for reform, introduced David to the crowd. 6 months ago, our community faced a crisis that could have torn us apart. Instead, it brought us together around shared values of fairness, justice, and respect for all people. Sergeant Thompson's courage in standing up for what's right, even when it was difficult, inspired all of us to demand better. David walked to the podium and looked out at the familiar faces of his neighbors and friends. "Thank you, Mayor Bradley. When I was arrested 6 months ago, I never imagined that it would lead to all of this." He gestured around the room. "But I've learned something important. Change doesn't happen because of one person or one incident. Change happens when a whole community decides that things need to be different." The applause was warm and sustained. David continued. "The new oversight board, the police reforms, the Pentagon initiative, these things happened because all of you demanded them, because you showed up to meetings, contacted your representatives, and refused to accept that discrimination was just the way things had to be." He paused, thinking about the long journey from that terrible night in jail to this moment of hope and progress. "But we can't stop here. The Oversight Board will only work if citizens participate in it. The police reforms will only last if we continue to hold our leaders accountable. Justice isn't something you achieve once and then forget about. It's something you have to choose again and again in small decisions and big ones." After the ceremony, David was approached by a young Army private who was home on leave. "Sergeant Thompson, I just wanted to thank you. I'm stationed at Fort Campbell, and the new protocols you helped create made a huge difference when I had to deal with local police last month." David shook the young soldier's hand. "What happened?" "I got pulled over for a broken taillight, and instead of treating me like a suspect, the officer was professional and respectful. He even thanked me for my service. The liaison program between the base and local police is working." Stories like this had been reaching David regularly over the past few months. Service members from around the country had contacted him to share their experiences with the new Military Personnel Protection Initiative. Police departments were participating in training programs with nearby military installations. Federal legislation was being introduced to strengthen protections for military personnel in civilian encounters. As David drove home that night, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that day he stopped to buy honey buns at Mrs. Patterson's store. He had become a reluctant symbol of civil rights, a speaker at conferences, and an advocate for police reform, but most importantly, He had remained a soldier committed to defending the Constitution and the values it represented. His phone rang, and he saw it was Colonel Rodriguez calling from Fort Bragg. "David, I wanted to let you know that the Army is promoting you to Sergeant First Class, effective immediately. Your conduct throughout this ordeal has been exemplary, and your advocacy work has brought great credit to the service." David pulled over to take the call properly. "Thank you, ma'am." "I'm honored." "David, I also wanted to tell you that the Pentagon is creating a new position, Special Advisor on Military-Civilian Relations. They want to offer it to you." David was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. "Ma'am, what would that involve?" "You would work with military installations." And 1 year later, David Thompson stood at a podium in the Ronald Reagan Building in Washington, D.C., addressing the National Conference on Military-Civilian Relations. The auditorium was filled with police chiefs, military commanders, civil rights leaders, and government officials from across the country. He wore his Army dress uniform with the new rank insignia of Sergeant First Class, along with a ribbon representing his work as Special Advisor on Military-Civilian Relations. The Pentagon position had given him a platform to turn his personal experience into systemic change. "Ladies and gentlemen," David began, his voice carrying clearly through the large auditorium, "a year and a half ago I was arrested for the crime of buying honey buns while black and wearing an Army uniform. Today, I'm here to report that the Military Personnel Protection Initiative has fundamentally changed how police and military personnel interact across our nation." The audience listened intently as David presented the statistics that showed the program's success. Reports of discriminatory treatment of military personnel had dropped by 67% in areas where the initiative had been implemented. More importantly, overall police-community relations had improved in these same areas. "The lesson we've learned," David continued, "is that protecting the rights of one group often means protecting the rights of everyone." When police departments implemented training and oversight to ensure fair treatment of military personnel, they also became more fair in their treatment of all citizens. After his presentation, David was approached by Chief Rebecca Santos from Millbrook County, who had traveled to Washington for the conference. "Sergeant Thompson, I wanted to update you on how things are going back home." Chief Santos had transformed the Millbrook County Police Department over the past year. Crime rates had actually decreased while community satisfaction with police had increased dramatically. "The Civilian Oversight Board has reviewed 42 complaints this year," she reported. 38 were resolved through mediation and training. 4 resulted in disciplinary action. Most importantly, we haven't had a single incident of discriminatory treatment." David smiled. "That's exactly what we hoped would happen." "How are your officers adjusting to the new standards?" "Better than I expected. Most of them want to do the right thing. They just needed clear guidance and proper training." "We've also hired 6 new officers who specifically chose to work here because of our reputation for community policing." That evening, David attended a reception for conference participants. He found himself in conversation with Dr. Jennifer Hamilton, the criminal justice professor who had helped his legal team understand the broader patterns of police misconduct. "David, I wanted to show you something," Dr. Hamilton said, pulling out her tablet. She displayed the same map of the United States she had shown him a year earlier, but now it looked completely different. "Remember this map?" The red dots were cases of discriminatory policing similar to yours. The map now showed far fewer red dots, replaced by blue dots in many locations. The blue dots represent police departments that have implemented reforms based on your case and the Military Personnel Protection Initiative. "We're seeing a real transformation in how law enforcement approaches community relations." David studied the map with satisfaction. "Dr. Hamilton, what do you think needs to happen next?" "Sustainability," she replied without hesitation. "The changes we've seen are encouraging, but reform efforts often lose momentum over time. The challenge is making sure these improvements become permanent parts of police culture." David nodded. "That's exactly what I've been thinking about. We need to embed these reforms so deeply that they can't be undone when people stop paying attention." The next morning, David flew back to North Carolina for a special event in Millbrook County. The town was dedicating a new community center that would house the Civilian Oversight Board, provide space for police community dialogue programs, and offer resources for residents who needed help navigating interactions with law enforcement. The dedication ceremony was held in the same high school auditorium where the first heated town hall meeting had taken place a year earlier. But the atmosphere this time was completely different. The crowd was diverse, celebratory, and united around shared achievements. Mayor Bradley, who had won re-election by the largest margin in the town's history after his strong support for police reform, spoke first. This community center represents what we can accomplish when we work together for justice and fairness. A year and a half ago, we faced a crisis that could have divided us permanently. Instead, we chose to come together and build something better. Reverend Washington blessed the new building. Offering a prayer for continued progress and reconciliation, Mrs. Patterson cut the ribbon, symbolizing the community's commitment to moving forward together. David was the final speaker. He looked out at faces that had become familiar over the past year, community activists who had fought for change, police officers who had embraced reform, young people who had organized voter registration drives, and ordinary citizens who had attended every town hall meeting. When I was arrested outside Mrs. Patterson's store, I felt angry, confused, and powerless, David said. But this community showed me something important. Individual acts of injustice can become catalysts for collective action. He paused, seeing nods of recognition throughout the audience. The reforms we've implemented here, the oversight mechanisms we've created, the relationships we've built between police and community, these things didn't happen because of one person or one incident. They happened because all of you demanded better and then did the work to make better possible. After the ceremony, David drove through the streets of his hometown. So much looked the same: the gas station where his ordeal began, the high school where he had played basketball, the neighborhoods where he had grown up. But everything felt different. He stopped at Mrs. Patterson's store, as he had done countless times over the past year. The elderly woman greeted him with her usual warmth, but there was something special in her eyes today. "David, honey, I have something for you." She reached under the counter and pulled out a framed photograph. The picture showed the moment when David had first returned to the store after his arrest. Mrs. Patterson had asked Carlos to take it, wanting to document what she called a young man's courage in the face of injustice. "I want you to have this," she said. "Not to remember the bad times, but to remember that good people can overcome bad times when they stick together." David accepted the photograph with tears in his eyes. "Mrs. Patterson, you've been like a grandmother to me. Your support meant everything. And your courage inspired this whole community to be better than we were." That evening, David sat on his front porch with his mother and sister, watching the sunset over the town that had shaped him and that he had helped reshape in return. His phone buzzed with messages from around the country. Police chiefs asking for advice on implementing reform programs. Military commanders reporting improvements in civilian relations. Civil rights advocates sharing success stories from their own communities. "David," his sister said, "do you ever think about what would have happened if you had just paid the fine and moved on?" David considered the question. "Sometimes. But I think about all the other people who have faced what I faced, and I'm glad we fought." His mother squeezed his hand. "Your father always said that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance." "You've been vigilant, baby?" David's phone rang. It was Colonel Rodriguez calling from Fort Bragg. "David, I have news. The Secretary of Defense wants to expand the Military Personnel Protection Initiative internationally. We've had requests from NATO allies who want to implement similar programs." David felt a familiar mix of excitement and responsibility. "Ma'am, what would that involve?" "It would mean traveling to Europe and other allied nations, helping them develop programs to protect military personnel from discrimination. Are you interested?" David looked around at his family, his community, and the place that would always be home. "Colonel, can I bring some of the people who helped make this program successful? This was never a one-person effort." "Absolutely. We want to export not just the policies but the community engagement model that made them work. After hanging up, David sat quietly with his family, processing the magnitude of what had grown from that terrible night in jail. 18 months earlier, his sister broke the silence. "So you're going to take the program international?" "We are," David replied, emphasizing the plural. "Because the lesson we learned here is that lasting change requires everyone's participation." As night fell over Millbrook County, David thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. From soldier to symbol to advocate to change. Agent. From victim of injustice to architect of reform, he thought about Officer Morrison, who was serving his federal sentence and would eventually be released with the opportunity to rebuild his life in a different direction. He thought about Officer Williams, who had become a leader in community policing, and was now training other departments. He thought about all the service members who would never face what he had faced, thanks to the reforms they had fought for. He thought about all the communities across the country that were implementing similar changes.